Welcome everyone here at the conference room and on Zoom. Good afternoon. My name is Ishu Mao and I'm pre-doc fellow at the Leeds Meitner Group. Before we start, I would just like to inform you that the lecture will be recorded, but not the Q&A. So today's lecture is a special lecture of the Leeds Meitner Research Group, China in the Global System of Science, where several of us are researching on the topic of artificial intelligence. AI is undoubtedly a hot topic at the moment. Vast amount of private and public funds are being invested in the field, and it is said that it will revolutionize economy, society, and even science. However, both media and scholarly debates are divided by opposing opinions with regards to AI's risks. Alongside warnings of AI posing existential crisis to humans, there are also warnings of this scaremongering effect on wasting society's valuable resources to deal with the mundane and yet real problems such as systemic bias, growing digital divide, loss of human dignity, and etc. In a moment of confusion like this, analysis from someone who is both an expert on the technicalities of AI, as well as the social and historical development of AI is extremely needed. And that's why today we're super honored to have Professor Joanna Bryson here. Professor Bryson is the Professor of Ethics and Technology in the Center for Digital Governance at the Hertie School in Berlin since 2020. Before, she taught at the Computer Science faculty at the University of Bath in the UK. She holds a PhD in computer science from the MIT, a MSc in artificial intelligence, and an MPhil in psychology from the University of Edinburgh, as well as a BA in behavior science from the University of Chicago. She has been researching at many interdisciplinary and distinguished institutions such as the Primate Cognitive Neuroscience Laboratory at Harvard, the Center for Social Science Research at the Mannheim University, as well as the Department of Anthropology at Oxford. She publishes widely on the topic of ethics and policy of technology, transparency, and system engineering for intelligence, as well as the nature of cognition. In addition to journal articles, she also contributes frequently to media outlets such as Forbes, Political, and The New Scientist. Besides teaching and writing, Professor Bryson advises governments, corporations, as well as other agencies globally on AI policy. She is one of the experts nominated by Germany for the Global Partnership for AI. She advises the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs on responsible innovation in AI for peace and security, and she is an appointed expert for the UNESCO Women for Ethical AI initiative. A few months ago, I heard from Professor Bryson that she's working on a book on the history of AI. Since then, I've been so excited to welcome you to this podium at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science for this lecture. Without further ado, the floor is yours, Professor Bryson.
Well, thank you very much for your generous introduction. I will not actually, I'm known for bias. I'm not going to talk about bias now, but I do have some slides at the end. So if you want to ask that in questions, we can go there. But anyway, whoops, and now, okay. So when I started up with this title, so this is one of the titles I've been thinking about for my book. And when I started up writing this talk for you, it's a new talk because I haven't finished the book. So this is the first time I've presented the book that's not done. I was thinking that have you heard of the singularity, right? I think it's the wrong way to think about artificial intelligence. And I thought of a singularity as a special case of a kind of inflection. And I wanted to say, look, there's not just one inflection, there's two, right? But actually I was wrong. So this is the picture I had. But it turns out mathematically, the only inflection is right in the middle of the, do I have a pointer? Right in the middle of the graph there. Whoops, no, that's not, yeah. That's not gonna do it. Okay, so right in the center, anyway. That it's when it goes from convex to concave. It's when you switch the way the curve goes. That's actually an inflection. Okay. So much for what I knew. And what you see at the bottom there, the yellow is the derivative. So it's how quickly are things changing. That's right at the peak of change. It's right at that point of inflection in the middle there. Okay. So this is called a sigmoid, actually. So I had thought this is the singularity. It's like, oh, everybody's getting excited because something's taken off, but we don't necessarily expect it to take off forever, right? And so I thought that this would be the second inflection, and that was what I wanted to talk about, okay? But actually, it turns out sigmoids, the whole point of a sigmoid from a neural networks perspective is that they avoid singularities. Singularities are points after which you can't know what's going to happen. It's something where that derivative would go infinite, right? So we used to use step functions. We used to have binary thinking. We used to go from the 0 there up to the 1, just straight. And then there was a point where you couldn't predict what was going to happen. The whole point of a sigmoid like this is that you're avoiding that. All right, so you may think, well, how did someone go to MIT and not know that? But I actually came out of liberal arts, and this is the kind of thing I knew, right? So this is the way I was thinking. Singularities are turning points, they're points of inflection, they're bottlenecks, knots, foyers, they're ways to go forward, they're points of tears and joy, right? This is the kind of thing I grew up thinking. But this is the first time I heard about singularity in the sense that you probably nodded about. Was I heard Werner Vinge. He did come to talk to MIT in about 1994, and he gave this same talk here. It was a little different. There were some other parts, but I want to draw attention here, how to survive in the post-human era. And the abstract down here, within 30 years, okay, and this is 1993, we will have technological means to create superhuman intelligence. Shortly after, the human era will be ended. And I can tell you, I was just talking to some people in Cambridge. I was asked to debate about whether AI was an existential threat. And, you know, they all clapped and my side won and whatever. But I thought I was very clear about the fact that the main existential threat of AI is of the people building it. It's not the AI itself that's a problem. So the belief in the existential threat is kind of an existential threat, right? But the students all said, no, we think there's going to be super intelligence within 2 years and that this is the end game. It's like, okay, right? So that was a little strange. Anyway, let's talk a little bit more about this. So here's a couple of the people talking about it recently, but as Werner Vinge said in his paper, the first person to really talk about this was I.J. Good. And actually, the first time he wrote about the intelligence explosion, he talked about it as a good thing. It was called our final invention. But the idea was that from then on, the inventions would invent themselves and we could lay back and drink sangria or something, right? And we wouldn't have to worry because the machines would do everything. Later in life, he was persuaded maybe that wasn't a good thing. but when he first wrote about it, it was a great thing. Well, Nick Bostrom, who was trying to fund a laboratory so he could just sit around and do philosophy in Oxford, figured out that this was, he figured out a way to cast this as entirely a bad thing, right? So he wrote the book, I think it is called Superintelligence, right? Yeah. And, but anyway, again, this intelligence explosion, the superintelligence, the singularity, the artificial general intelligence. Whoa, I've got 3 L's in intelligence. Okay, anyway, sorry about that. Is self-improving machine intelligence. Once you get to the point where you can learn how to learn yourself, that's what brings you to the singularity. And how will you know when you're getting there? You're going to see this exponential and exponential growth, okay? And then what happens? Even if you, in some sense, have control over the system, like you sat down and you designed it, you know what its goals are, this idea that there could be unintended consequences. So the system itself, because it's autonomous, is running out there and nobody controls it somehow. There's no power supply or something. Somehow it's run out of human control and it could do things we didn't mean. And for whatever reason, it is funny. He has a great sense of humor. I do like him. I've met him, whatever. He came up with this thing about the paper clips. So you set the computer to organize all the offices and it turns the entire planet into paper clips. Okay. Now this is bizarre, right? Like even if you think I mean, I guess it depends how you define organization. But the whole idea that we would have a system, we wouldn't know it had gone this far off kilter and we would allow it to turn the whole planet into paper clips, and that system would think, oh, now the office is organized. You know what? You know, it makes no sense, but this is common from some of these arguments. Anyway, so let's talk a little bit more about this exponential and exponential growth. I would argue that, well, first of all, if you can accept that intelligence can be decomposed, right? So it doesn't have to be an entire, complete, biological agent, but rather that, that you can have artificial intelligence that is only perception, right? Categorization, memory, for example, learning or reasoning, all the components of human intelligence, that each of those is artificial intelligence. Then I would argue that every single machine we've ever made is an example of AI. We're using machines to do things that humans can't do, or to do them more efficiently, right? And so most especially here is writing, okay? Because with writing, we are now able to explore more, basically. For millions of years, we had our technology looked relatively fixed, these axes. I mean, if you're an anthropologist, then you can tell them apart, right? But it was pretty slow progress. And then from the time of writing, innovation shoots off. And that's partly because we don't have to just rehearse things to make sure we get them right. We're able to write down how it was working and then go try some other tricks. That's the theory. Now that's just one theory. There's a lot of theories. A lot of things happened at this time. Agriculture, urbanization, doctrinal religion, lots of things happened that could explain how we came to the position we're in. But let's just choose writing as an example of one of them. But my argument here is that the intelligence explosion is us, okay? And here's my evidence. Notice that this population graph is grown on a log scale, right? Not across the bottom, the dates are relatively uniform, but look at this is 1, 10, 100. So 10,000 years ago, which is nothing in biological terms, right? Nothing. Right, we've been around as hominids for like 6 million years, okay? But 10,000 years ago, the macaques were winning. The macaques had already spread to almost every continent. They were doing really well. There was more macaques than there were people, right? Now, we are massively outnumbering the macaques, okay? So that's just, that I think we are the superintelligence. So if we're thinking about unanticipated consequences, I would say there have been many. But I think the one that most of us realize is the biggest problem right now is sustainability. So this is one example of the change, and I'm going to do a bunch of figures from this really awesome paper by Barnowski, but it's not the only person researching this area. You can see how as humanity spread from area to area, it brought down the amount of big wild animals. We were good hunters, basically, right? So we drove things to extinction. But this huge jump, again, around 10,000 years ago, where we really start dominating, our numbers start going up, and the number of other megafauna, it's called, goes down, right? So we are basically turning all the extant biomass and fossil fuels into more biomass, but fewer species, okay? It's an interesting kind of factory we've created. And in case you aren't good with graphs, this is the XKCD version. And this is from about 2008. It was based on data from the early, like 2002 or 2003. So trust me, there are far fewer wild animals left. And the green dots are the only wild, like large land mammals. So I used to say that we're not making paper clips, we're making cattle. But actually, I like this one better. A postdoc said it to me in Zurich. We're the paper clips. Right, we're turning the planet into us, and how did we not notice that? What are we going to do? So basically, if you haven't read all these little things, it's either the dark gray is us, and everything else is stuff we either eat or play with, like cats and dogs. All right. So coming back to this diagram, I want to go into a little bit more detail here. This is just in terms of the amount of biomass overall. We were reducing the amount of biomass, which is kind of bizarre at the beginning, but now we're building it up higher than it's ever been before, right? We've got ourselves together to do that. That's incredible. Whoops, I don't know what it's doing. Okay, who knows? So, and I think this is kind of interesting too, that you can see that the last time we had a big global warming push, that seems to have been part of what triggered some of the changes, some of the migrations and whatnot. And then we got a lot of innovation after that. Okay. All right. So the important thing here is that life tends, what we're doing with life is turning what's already there. Have you seen the sort of the Carl Sagan? It's amazing, you know, all the molecules and things that make up this planet. We're turning that into more of life. That's what life does, right? And we do that not only by destroying, you know, by changing the nature of how the molecules are arranged, but also by adding the energy that's coming from our sun, right? That's how we do this. So life isn't zero sum. It's not, it isn't, there is of course contestation for resources, but it doesn't only fight over the fixed resources. It tends to generate more and more life, okay? And that's partly because of this radiation thing we're getting from the sun. Life is actually productive, okay? So yeah, I think not enough is thought about evolution as being algorithmic, right? Evolution is the algorithm that perpetuates itself. And I don't know how fascinated you guys are as history or science people. This is like pretty prehistory, sorry. but the amazing thinking about the fact that how these chemicals ever came to reproduce themselves. But once that chance event happens, then you can see everything else follows from it. Everything that can persist, persists better and faster, right? And it does this both by improving the life chances of the individual replicator and also by cooperating, you know, so not only by that, but also by reproducing those individuals. So reproducing massive numbers of copies of that life algorithm. And so what's important here is that diversity helps increase the probability of finding new solutions, okay? So this is called Fisher's fundamental theorem of evolution, but it still applies into machine learning. It applies into everything we're trying to do, okay? On the other hand, if you only have diversity, if you just have absolute noise, you can't keep something as structured as life around, right? Well, life is not just noise. But in general, you want a lot of diversity, but as you get to good solutions, you do kind of focus on them. So that's sort of the trade-off and the interesting compact that is life and evolution. Okay, so I hope maybe we can think that you can see why I'm saying at least it's plausible to talk about this as the singularity, right? This is where we're starting off, something has happened that's really starting to change everything. The question is, are we here at this other one where things are maximally fast and are things going to start slowing down at some point? Of course, Vinge doesn't say that at all, right? It's not really an inflection to him. This is the exponential runaway that comes beyond any hope of control. And I think a lot of people feel this way about life right now, you know, as individuals. But in fact, we've been spending a long time developing, you know, well, historic time, developing ways to regulate and handle this complexity that we're creating. And it's important to recognize that this style of discourse happens a lot in America, right? So this paper is from a talk in 57. It was published in 64, but it documents things that are saying that it's the end of the world. So going back to the early, like I think even back certainly through the 1800s, I can't remember if there's stuff going back to the sort of certainly the colonial era when the sort of the radical religious people that were coming also were very much extremists in these kinds of beliefs. So, but anyway, I'm sort of going back to thinking again about this exponential. Is this an exponential? So I couldn't find on the internet any pictures of a petri dish. You know, so when I'm thinking about this stuff, I think of a petri dish and you put something in the middle and everybody has like a million petri dishes with lots of random things. This is super interesting. It's a giant petri dish with different amounts of antibiotics sprayed into this. And so what you're watching are mutation events that are helping bacteria get through antibiotics, okay? So they're not trying to make it mutate. It's just that it's stuck there until it comes up against this. This is obviously massive time lapse. It takes like a week to actually conquer antibiotics, but not that long. Surprisingly not long. But anyway, you see the kinds of spreads. So this is the thing I was actually looking for and I couldn't find. That is exponential because even though it's linear, it's happening in every direction and you get this exponential effect. What happens when you hit the limits of your resources? All right. So when you have a new strategy, you can have this massive expansion. But at some point, you get to the limits of the petri dish. And I don't know if you guys have heard about the donut economy or whatever. At some point, you get to sort of the limits, and then you tend to stabilize, right? So there's beautiful work. I absolutely love Our World in Data. The world is better off than you know, and they collect all the data about the good things that are happening too. But there's some people that are in total panic about the dropping birth rates in humanity right now. But look at what's happened. The death rate dropped first, right? So this period between when the death rate drops and when the birth rate drops is what accounts for this massive increase in population. And then we get to a place where we are now. And this question of degrees of will it increase a little more, will it decrease a little more, or maybe it will level off like that drawing I was showing you, right? But this is my argument that this is where we are certainly in Europe, but it looks like a lot of the world. And it's not just birth control. It actually seems to be when you get to the point where where mothers don't know anybody whose child has died. It seems like when you lose a child, you invest less in your individual children. When nobody loses children, you invest everything you can in making the success of the children, which leads you to have fewer children. Does that make sense? Anyway, there's a lot of data around this, but some people argue education of the mother. I know that's another series, but that's similar, right? It's about investment in the individual. Okay. So if we think this is the full sustainable petri dish, maybe we're up here, right? Maybe we're getting to the point right now where we're seeing all this conflict. We're seeing a lot of stuff that indicates we need to change how we're doing things. The way that we were doing things isn't going to work for us. And so what we really need to be is smart enough to get through the transition of our economy gracefully. Okay, so this is the end of my first bullet point of my outline. I'm sorry I didn't show that to you before, but I wanted to explain the title. Okay, so we're through this idea, sort of the shape of the artificial intelligence timescape. And now I'm going to come in and start talking a little bit more about conventional computation, intelligence, morality, and rights. And that's the second bullet, okay? But I swear it's not as complicated in a way as the first bullet. And then, so it gets easier, okay. All right, so while I say that, this is the slightly complicated, yes?
So in this graph that you have, like what makes you think that we are in a given place on that? You asked the question here.
Great question, and there's a point to ask that question at the very end. So I'm literally in the slides, not just during the Q&A. So we'll come back to that. No, but that's why there was question marks all the way through that. I'm not sure where we are, but I'm just saying it seems possible, given the limits that we seem to be hitting, that we might be at this other point. But again, because of things like AI, who knows? Maybe we will ramp back up again, and probably almost certainly sometime we will. Oh, that was another slide I forgot to grab. Okay, I better keep going though, because the first third already took like half the time. So yeah, so it's important to understand that intelligence, a lot of people confuse computation and math, and they are not at all the same, okay? Computation is a physical process. It takes time, it takes space, it takes energy. That's why you have to plug in your laptop. It's not just the light, right? And it's why you go out and buy extra memory for your laptop, right? So we are, it's a conversion of information, a systematic conversion of information. So if you're trying to do something like finding the right thing to do at the right time, which is basically a possible definition of intelligence, then you have to do something like search. And just to give you an idea of how hard search is, how hard it is to be smart. Sorry, this is like one of two equations in the whole talk. It's not a big deal. The cost of search is proportional to the number of options you have raised to how many things you get to do. Now, I know that doesn't mean anything, so let me give you an example. Okay, let's say that I had a robot and it had 100 actions that you knew how to do. And if you gave if you said, okay, I want you to go to Tokyo, and it had to just try each of the 100 actions, right? If one of the 100 actions is go to Tokyo, then in the worst case, it would have to try 100 things and suddenly find itself in Tokyo. All right. But let's say you have to turn left and then go to Tokyo, right? So there's two things you have to do. trying 100 things after 100 things is already 10,000 possible plans. Now, I know that Go is a harder game than chess, but the same guy who figured out information theory, Claude Shannon, also sat down one day and figured out that there are more possible 35 move games of chess. So not just moving the rook back and forth forever, right? 35 move games of chess, and there are a number of atoms in the universe, okay? This is the explosion of all the things we could do, right? And intelligence is trying to pick out which of those to do, right? So the solution to this, one of the solutions to this is concurrency. So we can all do this in parallel. Well, and that's what you have, like a laptop like this probably has 816 processors in it, right? You know, and you all know that AI is being done with massive GPUs right now. But when you take something apart, when you take it into pieces, there's an overhead there. So you're not get if you had two laptops, you're going to spend twice the energy, right? It takes up twice the space, but you're not quite going to get double the speed because you have to combine the outputs. All right. Quantum is really interesting because for some kinds of problems, you're able to run them all in the same space and at the same time. But so far, it isn't looking like it's saving energy. It seems to take an enormous amount of energy to keep the little quantum bits in the right places. So right now, it looks like quantum is only going to be used by really rich nation states and really rich companies. It doesn't look like it's going to be something everyone can use. And incidentally, there was a lot of men at the beginning, so there's going to be some women towards the end here. Oh no, I forgot to put one of them in. Oh well. Here we go. At least one quantum physicist to help me think about this stuff. But I've been talking to a lot of people over the years about this now. So the one definition of artificial general intelligence is omniscience. There was this idea that if we had the perfect algorithm, it would just go out, know all the things, and then that whatever country got that first would suddenly know how to solve all the problems and beat all the other countries. Okay. I've been in the U.S. where generals were talking about that in a room, in a sort of a think tank kind of room. That's not ever going to happen, okay? But you still see some of the people right now with the large language models or whatnot, they seem to believe all the knowledge is out there and they just need to recombine it. It's like, no, we still have computation to do. There is stuff that nobody knows. Yes, you can synthesize what was known, but it's this sort of pseudo, supernaturalist belief that somebody has planted all the knowledge somewhere on the planet. We just need to recombine it. That's not the way it is, okay? So anyway, going back to definitions, as I mentioned, intelligence, you can think of it as the subset of all the different kinds of computation you could do that takes the current situation and chooses an action that's appropriate in that situation. Where appropriate here means for some kind of goal. I just talked about the goal of evolution is persistence, but when we build something with AI, then we get to pick its goals. And interestingly, our lives are, by that definition, I've just said that we're kind of animals. We kind of want to persist. We have a lot of our motivation system that way, but we do pick our own goals. So we're kind of hybrid between natural intelligence and AI ourselves. We invent our own lives a little bit. Anyway, it's important to recognize that how we do this is that we don't try to solve all the problems at once. We all have a small part of the universe we know about, and we create a specialized kind of mapping to handle it. You can almost think of every intelligent agent as like a compressed version of the universe. You're just solving one little problem over in the corner. It's kind of cool. Anyway, I like thinking about it that way. Okay, so a lot of people are like, well, what even is artificial intelligence? In this definition I just gave you, artificial intelligence is the subset of the computation that does something that creates an action from a context that someone deliberately built, right? It's very simple. It's just intelligence with artificial in the front, okay? And that is what brings us back to the regulation stuff. Now, some people say, well, that's not what I meant. I meant agency. And if you're like, or somebody, again, I don't know, I'm treating you, I know you're historians of science, I'm treating you like philosophers. If you've heard of Davidson or somebody like that, then everything you're talking about is agency. But there's also definitions of agency that are like, chemical agents. The ones that have a chemical reaction are called the agents, right? So what we really care about by our nature, by our moral nature, is the moral agents. What we care about is who is responsible for their action. And notice that that is something that societies chose. There is not an agreement about how old do you have to be to serve in the military, how old do you have to be to consent to sex, how old do you have to be to get married. Maybe you never get to choose who you marry, right? There's a lot of differences by society about what becomes an agent. The other thing you care about is those who are responsible. What are they responsible for? Well, they're responsible, that whatever they're responsible for is called a moral patient. Now, again, in most societies, the other moral agents have a certain kind of patiency. Babies, have a big moral patiency. Some of us are now agreeing that the climate is something we're responsible for, the ecosystem, but not everyone agrees, right? So these are things that are determined by a society. I would argue that ethics is determined by and determines a society, right? I would argue that these kinds of decisions is everything. This is what our ethics are. So they are kind of socially specific. Now, some people hate this because they think it means that I'm saying, oh, it's all arbitrary, it's POMO. No, I'm just saying that recognize that you need to index. You can still say, oh, we're better than, 1930s Germans because there's fewer Nazis here or something, right? But you have to say that part, that last part about what is the metric by which you're comparing. We're not just absolutely more ethical. I mean, the Nazis had very strong moral considerations of what they considered to be right and proper too. So you have to say, we think that these are the things that are important, like, equal life chances or something like that. And then you can say, by that metric, we are more ethical. But in describing that metric, you are sort of describing a society as well. Okay. So, and I would also argue that responsibility is basically the property of moral agents. It's just describing what it means that you're holding each other to account for something. Okay, that you're in a society, you have expectations about what that means to be an accepted member of that society. All right. So, and I would also argue that this implies a peer relationship, and we'll come back to this at the end too. Believe it or not, this will come back to AI again. Okay, because a lot of what our problems are, well, in fact, the next slide has a bit about this. A lot of our problems is about how do we enforce responsibility on the people who are creating the artificial intelligence. Now, notice that I talked about the people who are creating the artificial intelligence. I'm already assuming I'm right here, right? Robots are not our peers, okay? They're designed, they're owned, and by the current ways we're thinking about ethics in the West right now, that implies that consensual relationships are impossible. Now, I was horrified when I first heard this. That, for example, this implies that there was never consensual sex between a slave and their owner, okay? Because the slave is not in a context, the power context in which they can meaningfully consent to sex. This is the same idea that you're not supposed to have sex with small children, right? They may say they consent, they may think they consent, but we have decided as a society that's not real consent. They don't know what they're doing, right? And the same thing about why you don't have sexual relationships between professors and undergraduates, right? That kind of thing. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons that robots are not like us. The right way to think about robots is that they're extensions of corporations, right? They're components of corporations that you have in your house, recording you in various ways, right? And so the interesting thing here is that how then do we control the corporations themselves? And we do that through creating a large enough agency to be peer-like to it, right? So we use the government and we enforce antitrust to try to make sure that we have corporations that are on a scale that we can control them. Okay, we'll come back to that. So coming back to the principles of artificial intelligence, thinking about, and this was originally written by the OECD, but the G20 signed up to them as well. So 50 countries, including the UK, the US, and China, have agreed to this, and Germany, sorry, I should have stuck Germany in there, duh. AI should benefit people on the planet, there's only 5, don't worry, by driving inclusive, sustainable growth, right? And development, right? So that we're thinking about the whole world. AI systems should be designed in a way that respects the rule of law. Look, the rule of law and AI are both artifacts, but we've spent thousands of years getting the rule of law stable. So to the extent possible, we want to make sure the artifacts comply with the law, not change the law to comply with the artifacts, right? So we want that. We want human rights, democratic values, and diversity. Yes, China signs up to this. You know, every nation in the world has elections now. That people think of there being a binary between autocracy and democracy, but there isn't really a binary there either. It is more like a continuum of how much structure you have, and how much the elections actually matter. Okay. There should be transparency and responsible disclosure around AI systems to ensure that people understand when they're engaging with them. That's a little overly confusing in my mind, but this is actually also in the AI Act. This is the only rule for every single AI system in the European Union once the AI Act comes into force. So there's most of what you hear is which AI systems are banned and which ones are high risk, which is not that big of a deal. The high risk ones just have to have decent accounting like any other ordinary product about so that we can hold people responsible for their behavior. All right. But all AI, even if it's trivial, the one rule is that you can't tell people it's a person. They have to know they're working with an AI system. Okay. So AI systems must function in a robust and secure and safe way throughout their lifetimes. And organizations and individuals developing, deploying, and operating the AI system have to be held accountable. So again, the system isn't accountable for itself. This is the way we're thinking about instruction in the world. This was a lot of work. It may seem obvious to some of you. I wouldn't be surprised if some of you still think that's just so wrong. It's prejudice against the robots, right? If you think the robots themselves are moral patients, then you should not want them to be people, right? Because it's not good to be owned if you're a person, right? And designed by a corporation. So anyway, this is the sort of the 5 basic principles of AI. So since then, we've actually done more work. Since 2022, the UNESCO, every single country except the United States, because Trump had pulled them out of UNESCO, signed this thing that says that, and they work together. And oh yeah, I'm not going to go into the details. It's compatible with what I said. But if you've ever read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, well, if you haven't, you should. It's really short and it's super interesting. You can see a lot of negotiations going on there. But then read the ethics, the recommendation on ethics of AI. It's a bunch of pages, but they're like big type, you know. And it's really interesting. To me, it reads like they're just trying to make an extension of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for the digital age, for all the different things we can now do to each other. It is also totally based on sustainable development goals, which is absolutely necessary. Right? Development and sustainability are interdependent. You're not going to bring people into agreements, you know, costly agreements, without making sure that they can meet their needs. There has to be fairness. So it's important to recognize, and I bring it up in this context, human rights itself is a contested situation. I have been, this is not something I've just read about, I've been in rooms where people are saying this. You know, you killed a lot of people. You killed your own people, you killed other people to get to where you are. Now you own the world and you're trying to stop us from doing the same, right? You know, that's kind of, you know, so even this, especially when you talk about privacy, people are saying, we don't want privacy. We want to have enough money to feed our children, right? So this is the kind of discussions you get into. I want to talk a little bit more about rights because I think it's really important now that we are doing our AI governance in a rights centering. A lot of people think about it as entitlement. So in the old days, we sort of had this model that government is this thing where some guy or woman actually can, I think I went, there we go, rides up with a big sword and says, listen, you guys, I'm going to take stuff off of you, but I'm also going to protect you because you're mine, right? And that was kind of the old way we thought about government. Nowadays, you know, since the American Constitution, but the more so that with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we have this framing where the government has obligations. It's this thing with all these obligations because there's these rights that have been discovered that we are, each of us, passively entitled to. An interesting part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that every country has signed up to, that I think a lot of people forget, is this is not about citizens, the right of citizens, it's the rights of every single person standing in a country. If you're in a country, that country's government is obliged to defend your rights, which includes positive rights, like healthcare, like wages, like a job, right? This is what we've all signed up to. That way, every single person has at least one government watching out for them, okay? So that's the way we're currently, that's the current UN standard, the Council of Europe and things. I actually have an alternative framing I kind of like better as I've been trying to understand AI. So I came to governance, you know, governance is not my degree. You heard my degree is artificial intelligence and behavioral science. So I think a better way to think about it is all these residents constitute the state, right? And the government is the means that we use to coordinate our public goods, right? Like I mentioned before, we have a problem if someone gets so much power that they can just wipe us out. And so we have to make sure that doesn't happen. And that's what we are kind of using governments for right now. What's nice about this is it changes the way that you're thinking of rights. Instead of there being some absolute truth you just go find and the people are passively entitled to, it becomes something where you're saying, these are concepts that we have found are useful for making sure that we can do the best we can as a society, which includes having security, building stuff, doing all the pieces we want to do. All right. And also, I'm gonna have to say this is less adversarial model of government. Part of what brought me to this is like arguing with people from the US West Coast who just are like, why are you helping people constrain us? I'm like, I'm not, I'm helping people help us, right? The regulation is actually about, like I said, coordination and trying to make sure that we have enough, customers, employees, and a stable planet that we can flourish on, right? That's what it's about. Okay, so this is my harshest slide in this talk. There are a few countries right now that are absolutely flattening each other's cities. This is like the bias slides. I could talk a lot about bias. I wrote one of the big papers on it. But how can we sit around and only talk about bias when people are, not everybody, a few countries are flattening other cities, completely, right? That we know that we had documented were targeting hospitals, like in the case of Russia and Syria, right? Some countries don't value their own residents' lives. Again, you can famously say, oh, China. It's actually kind of interesting. China is trying not to kill too many people. It's just trying to make them all conform to one stereotype. You actually got subsidies if you were Han Chinese and you married an ethnic minority, even during the one-child period, you got more money the more children you had. Okay, so there's an effort to reduce diversity there. And Russia, it's not only that they're throwing kids with shovels against the Ukrainians, it's insane, but also that if you just look at their population, like we're talking about 30–40% of the population that doesn't have central heating, doesn't have internal plumbing, doesn't have access to any kind of toilet, right? They're not taking care of this huge proportion of their own population. But I don't mean to just pick on Asia. Like, one of the reasons Brexit happened was that from 2005 until 2015, there was an incredible increase of inequality, right? There was an incredible impoverishment of the North. And you can read about it, that the UN had to come and point out to London this was happening, and the conservative government still denied it. But even though I was sort of, reading The Guardian or whatever, I didn't realize I phoned up a friend. We both grew up in the same small village in Illinois. But she was living in Wales, and she's like, oh, we've cut back to 3.5 days a week for schools because we can't afford schooling. What? Somewhere in the EU, it's only teaching 3.5 days of school to their kids. I couldn't believe it. And look at the US, right? Again, there's some pretty interesting data on this. If you look at the individual states of the United States, none of them have had declines in life expectancy. What's happening is that people are moving from the states of high life expectancy to the states of lowest life expectancy. And my question is why, right? If they do that at their own free will, if they say, look, I like smoking, right? I like having traffic accidents while I'm drunk, right? Okay, you're an adult. I don't know how to stop you from doing that. But if it's because corporations are saying, we're moving you away from where you guys have struggled for decades and created unions and created a healthcare system, and we're putting you out in the less regulated states, then I think that's problematic, right? So it's an interesting question. And again, that data is open right now. And then I talking about these kinds of things, life and death, may seem like a bigger deal, but if we're worried about our sustainability, we have to worry about free thought. We have to worry about innovation. And so again, I was just in China this summer, the fourth time I've been there altogether, the third time I've been there for WEF. And elite people were afraid to talk. The journalists were telling me that that they couldn't get anyone to come on the camera or on the microphone. Nobody would say anything. There was about 3 or 4 people total in the 3 days I heard that went off the party line. They're courageous people. One was from Hong Kong, right? But but by and large, everyone was either saying exactly the party line. I even had someone I was sitting next to on the bus, randomly, I just happened to sit down, it was a bus, right? That spent like several minutes getting to the point of saying that he missed being in America, he missed being free, and that's like, it sounds like Soviet era propaganda, but it is a huge shift. But again, it's not only China. In the United States, truck drivers, there's a wonderful, I should have put her name, Karen Levy, has written a PhD dissertation about truck drivers. Now she's working in agriculture. They are being completely surveilled, right? Every aspect of what they do, they have to do it by the book, right? And there's also health insurance, things like this, where they're mandating that you have your bio trackers, they're your Fitbits or whatever, in order to get your health insurance. So you're getting, I think we don't recognize the extent to which we're living. Some of our colleagues, some people that we talk to are already starting to live in the dystopias that some of us are arguing about whether will happen, right? So it's scary. And the one last thing I'll make out of an example of this is in Albania, they had done all this great work. So they had a high level of corruption, and they did all this great work about making their stuff digitalized. And then she said, yeah, that's great, but now you can only get public services through the digital. And so what's happened is we've completely eliminated, you no longer have to pay a bribe to your teacher to teach your kid, but the top level controls the whole system. So that you've increased the high level corruption by giving the high level more power while decreasing the petty corruption. And again, that seems to be what's happening in China. Again, people talk about democratic backsliding, but don't forget, China has had autocratic backsliding. They thought they were going somewhere cool, and they are not happy about having a third term for Xi, right? So very similar things have happened to China, the Chinese party, as happened to the Conservative Party in the UK and the Conservative Party in the United States. Diversity, I mentioned this before, but I'll just say it again. You need diversity. I guess we can kind of understand that. But literally, the rate of evolution, the amount you can change, is proportional to the amount of variation, right? So getting that right, less variation means less robustness for addressing underlying change. We need privacy, tolerance, and diversity. It's essential to our capacity to innovate. And I think we need to really worry about that. All right, so the last third of my talk in the last 5 minutes. I'm trying to leave you guys half an hour for Q&A, but I apologize. I haven't run this talk before, and I've gone on a little too long. First of all, as I said before, regulation is the means by which a complex entity perpetuates a recognizable version of itself. It is not like some weird thing that's done to you. I keep forgetting, this is not doing anything. Okay. Do you see that little thing in the middle that has 2 balls on it? That's like a regulator, right? That it spins around. If this machine goes too fast, then gravity pulls the regulator down, and it makes the machine run at the right speed. It's completely mechanical, right? No intelligence except for it to create it in the first place. Breathing is regulation. We want to have the right amount of oxygen in our bodies, not too much and not too little. You can be poisoned by oxygen too, right? So regulation is just normal. Yeah, in biology, one of my co-authors, an area that I no longer have time for, but in biology, we talk about up-regulation as well as down-regulation, right? And that's what, when people say, don't regulate our industry, I'm like, what are you talking about? Every country in the world is pumping money into AI. That is a form of regulation. It's increasing the amount of AI. But we're also trying to constrain it to do things that don't destroy the hand that's feeding it, right? That you are trying to make sure the government can handle it. And again, that's happening in autocracies as well as democracies. So some people don't think AI is knowable. That's why they think regulation is only about throwing it out the window, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's nuts. It's easy to make AI transparent. The black box thing is the disinformation myth. No, you're never going to know what all the little trillions of weights do in a giant model. But you never go into a bank and say, what are the synapses doing in that person over there? What about that one synapse, right? Nobody cares about the brain cells, right? They look at the system overall. And that's what we're going to be auditing too. Have you actually followed best practice? Have you done due diligence? Just like any other product, we want to make sure, we want to help the sector level itself up, right? We aren't going to write new laws every time AI changes. We're just going to start regulating AI the way we already regulate other products. It's not that big of a deal. So what we're regulating is the human behavior. And that means you have to have architected the system. Again, one of those crazy like Bostrom style things. This wasn't Nick Bostrom's group. This was the Future of Life Society at MIT. But they said, what if you had a system that was trying to learn to play chess and it noticed you shut it off at night and it shot you? And people really worry about this. I'm like, nobody writes a chess learning program with a gun. Like, what would that even mean, right? A chess learning program, remember that big space I showed you? It doesn't even know what night and day are. That doesn't help. How would it know that it was night? And no programmer anywhere shuts off their computer at night. We wanted to do the machine learning. This is showing complete ignorance of the field. Okay, so someone has sat down, architected the system. Someone has to cyber secure it. Otherwise, any of your digital records are worth nothing, right? So I'm not saying that all AI is transparent. I'm saying it's easy to make it transparent, but it does involve doing this stuff. And if you don't do these kinds of things, then you are negligent and you should be held liable for anything that goes wrong with your system. That's the whole point of product law. It's not that, well, we hope that people will go in and proactively make it so that they don't get themselves and their companies into trouble. You know, compliance with law often actually saves you trouble, right? That's the whole point. But okay, that may sound trivial there, but in the business sense, it is actually about steering you in a way that you're likely to succeed and be stable and employed. That's what we want. Every government wants their economy to be strong, right? So all these kinds of things, I mean, I learned to do this in the 80s. It was bleeding edge in the 1980s when I was a programmer, right? It is not bleeding edge anymore. Most software companies even do this stuff, but AI companies aren't, right? It's nuts. So we're just trying to bring the 1980s at least standards up. It will help you maintain your own products if any of you are developers, as well as being able to prove to the government that you were doing the right things and it's not your fault the system broke, right? Everyone should know if something goes wrong with the AI system, was it because they broke something, or was it because the user did something wrong, or did somebody hack it? Was it a cyber event? Those are basically the three things that can happen. Okay. So I'm going to skip the stuff about I don't think we talk about the EU. There's a bunch of stuff about the EU. If you want to, we can do this in Q&A too. I might talk a little about Twitter. Poor Twitter, right? Twitter wasn't just data, right? But although there is a huge amount of data there, our entire political history, basically the last 15 years, everybody was using it. But it's basically a giant comms network. We chose who to follow. People spent a lot of time compressing their thoughts into a small number of characters so you could read it, and then choosing who they thought did that well, that was interesting and useful for them. It's an incredible network. And I think Musk doesn't realize that point either. He doesn't understand how hard he's like, why can't I just change this? I've made these changes, and like, why isn't it all going away? You know, why can't I make it into the kind of network I want? Well, that was a huge amount of compute. Remember what I was talking about? It's physical process. You can't just change that. So ordinarily, we would prefer markets that set the prices and guarantee good behavior. The pure organizations monitor each other for corruption, rat each other out to the governments, and the governments enforce good behavior. That's the kind of thing we want. But sometimes that's not enough. There's certain kinds, so we're trying to avoid concentrations of power that cause trouble. But for certain kinds of products like Twitter, like electricity, like telephone networks, you really do want one large thing. And in that case, you actually need more governance, not less, because the market isn't there to do the job of setting prices and policing corruption. Okay, so yeah, so basically I think that AI is now being produced as a transnational utility, and we don't really know how to govern those yet. This is another area of innovation. It's really cool. It is something we need to think about. It's diplomacy, and it's also governance, and it's also business, and they have to work together. I will say quickly that polarization is not correlated with social media use, incidentally, political polarization, but is correlated with inequality, at least in the United States, actually in most countries, but not Germany and not China. And so we were trying to understand why this was. And well, let me say a little bit more about inequality. So again, like as with diversity, it's not that you want no inequality. If you have more than a Gini coefficient goes from 0 to 1. So if it's over 0.3, you tend to get social unrest, you get loss of social mobility, the economy declines, right? And generally people start hating each other, right? But if it's too low, then you also have a less productive economy. So it seems like we like to have some kind of a gradient. We want to, or maybe it's just beneficial to get money to the people who are being most productive. So inequality is the thing that that you don't want too much of, but you want a little. So where does it come from? One of the things people used to think was, and it's probably true, regulatory capture. So you can see since 1978, we've been in an incredible spiral of increasing polarization and inequality, right? And this has just only gone up, shooting up faster since then. So that might be because some people get a hold of the laws and break them open so that they benefit the rich, right? But how did it bootstrap in the first place? Because we do have these relatively longer periods of relatively low inequality. It may well be when we have new technologies that make it easier to do business over a larger distance. So there's nothing corrupt about it. It's just that you can now go to the best search engine, right? And you can go to the best search engine in the whole world if you speak English. Sorry, there may be a better one in another language, but that's the one I know, right? So the same thing happened in the 19th century. In the 19th century, it was the innovation of telegraphs and railway systems. And so suddenly there was these people with enormous amounts of money, right? And that was when we invented antitrust. Okay, when it gets to the point of extreme high inequality, the last time it was as high as it is right now, we got World War I. It's basically there's individuals that are more powerful than countries. It's not surprising borders become less useful, right? The reason we invented antitrust and competition law, the United States did it, oops, sorry, another spelling error, was because there was a concern that if individuals become too powerful, a democracy can't control them, right? Again, autocracies have ways of dealing with individuals, but under the rule of law, can you handle too powerful an individual? Unfortunately, we're in a situation of trying to find that out. Economic contexts predict populism better than things like language and culture, right? It isn't the places that are rebellious or at least susceptible to Russian influence in Ukraine were not the ones that were the most ethnic Russians. They were not the ones that were the most Russian language speakers. It was the ones where the economy had just collapsed because the steel or coal or whatever had fallen over. That was the best predictor. The same was true for Brexit. The same was true for voting for Trump. All right. So I want to say quickly about democracy, and I'm running over. Sorry, I've never run this talk before. Trust, we have a theory, this is published, that basically trust is a luxury good. So why I mentioned before that a couple of countries have dealt even with inequality, high inequality, Germany and China, still have relatively low polarization. And we think the real problem is when you have economic precarity, then you can't trust diverse outgroups because they're less predictable. So you go for something that has a lower expected economic payoff in order to make sure you have what you need to not go bankrupt. Okay. So in that sense, trust is a luxury good. You can only take the risk of innovating, building new novel public goods, working with diverse others when you have some money, right? If you're about to go bankrupt or starve to death or foreclosure or lose custody of your children, you're not going to take risks. All right. So, and that's why China and Germany have done quite well, because for historic reasons, both of those countries work really hard to make sure that when the boat's going up, even if it's going up faster for the people at the top, the bottom are also benefiting, right? At least a little. So they're highly regulated. So while we were doing that work, I'm sorry about that, Bill. So first of all, this is evidence. Ignore the gold down there for a second. So that was a published model I just showed you. This is a preprint, and you can see that this is across the world. that having a high national unemployment rate, it's not being unemployed yourself, it's the national unemployment rate increases your polarization, it's the main factor. And having high income inequality doesn't increase polarization, but does decrease social trust, which is super interesting, actually. But the reason I had this highlighted here, this is called ethnic fractionalization. So the idea is that if you have too many different ethnicities, you're more likely, it's basically easier. So with lower stress, you still have society fragment because there's a clear place to fragment. So like race in the US or something. And why I bring that up is we show the standard outcome for polarization, although not trust. Why that's interesting is because the reverse seems to be true for democratic backsliding in Eastern Europe. Okay, so where you have the countries that have the most diversity, ethnic diversity, have the least, or I shouldn't say, it's not just the most diversity, it's the largest minority populations are the ones that have the least democratic backsliding. And so we think that's because the minority populations know they need to hold on to democracy to make themselves safe, right? So even though there's a natural cleavage, and maybe it's the majoritarianism that's the real problem for endangering rights. Okay, and this is also just another thing. I'm interested in what's the best size of country and organization for various reasons, but just look at the difference between how well democracies do for this is this ranking, the rating there on the left on the y-axis is the World Bank's idea of effective government, which is basically measures of how well everybody is doing, the population overall. Okay, so democracies take care of people a lot more. The global sample is including the democracies. All right, so imagine what that would be if you pulled the democracies out of it. Okay. All right. So I am going to come back for the conclusion a little bit, back to the question we had in the front here. Yeah, this is another inflection, actually. This is the kind of inflection I was thinking about. It's X cubed, apparently. But if you have that kind of a shape of a graph, you can kind of imagine that flat part gets stretched out, and that would look like the bottom part of our sigmoid there, right? And so maybe what we're really doing is creating a whole bunch of steps. And if you look over the history of life on the planet, then you would see something like that. You would see, first you had the microbia, and then you get the plants. The vast majority of the biomass right now is plants, right? And now we're turning it into these large animals, but it's currently a relatively small number of species. There is this whole question, is there another one of those kinds of things that's going to happen next? Right? I didn't bother to draw it there. But maybe there really are two inflections of the AI era. Maybe there's even three. Maybe that we're at this point in the middle where everything is changing really fast, but it will slow down. Or maybe it's starting to slow down, at least if we're thinking about how many people there can be. Although that is generating a lot of different kinds of changes to our economies to deal with this. So our current concern, I think, is to handle the present transition as gracefully and sustainably as possible. And I believe well-regulated AI can help us think and do that better.